Well, it's been an absolutely amazing day. I brought with me a couple of tools I thought I might use, but after about 5 minutes into Al's presentation, I thought, nah, we've got to start from scratch. We've got to start from scratch here. So, it's the first time I've ever been it's a new word to me, a discussant. I'm told it's an academic word, so that probably says quite a lot about me. It's a pleasure to be the discussant. If you had any idea of the mess that is on the few sheets of paper I have in front of me, you would probably be more apprehensive than I am right now. But what I'm going to try and do is just outline 4 or 5 things that, for me, I think have emerged from the inputs that we've had. Definitely not answering questions, probably raising some more questions. But also, I think it's a combination, I suppose, of my own passions from a whole career of engagement with Christian social justice, as well as probably it's that combined with, you hear what resonates with you, don't you? So I kind of make no apology for that. I don't just want to rehash what we've heard. So I was hoping that, it's Anna, isn't it? That Anna, because she's got such fantastically neat writing, might write up. My message is this: building a politics of hope means embracing subversion. Okay, and I've got 5 forms of subversion, and I wondered if you might write them up for me. The first thing is subversive language.
Sorry, what was that?
Subversive language. Subversive affinities. Subversive power. Subversive hope. And subversive faith identities. I was really struck, faith identities. I was really struck in Al's presentation about the whole concept of naming and renaming. Theologian Sally McFaig said that the limits of I think it was her anyway, the theologians in the room will correct me, the limits of one's language are the limits of one's world. And that's always been true. In terms of feminist theology, queer theologies, how we talk about things really matters, and the language that we use really matters. And we name and rename according to our theological vision. And I think the challenging of toxic language is really, really important in this context. We've talked about, or Al talked about, lack, talked about stigma. The phrase benefits black spot is one that is particularly, for many, more than one reason, toxic. And I love the language of assets. I love the language of abundance. I love the celebration, the concept of celebration, but the language of celebration as well. The celebration of local heroes. What are we saying when we take things that have been described in one way and we describe them in another way, and we celebrate in the process? And in the process, we expose injustice and we expose toxicity. So that thing about the naming of addiction, I thought was fantastic. And the naming of an addiction to power, a particular kind of power. And a lot of the things that Mohammed was saying about the assumptions that he comes across in terms of the work that he's trying to do. And I think we would resonate, those of us who work from a Christian perspective, in some ways, but I think, ratchet it up. Ratchet it up several levels in terms of what he was talking about. The assumptions about what is perceived to be a Muslim service, what that will mean about partiality, discrimination, and all the things that project is not. I have a colleague in Rose Hill in Oxford, which is another stigmatised community, and she's working there on a community cupboard. She hates the phrase food bank, and it's not really a food bank, but it's a community cupboard. And she has an idea that if it emerges anywhere, I'll know you've stolen it. But she says, well, we have areas of outstanding natural beauty in this country. What about if we had an award for areas of outstanding community beauty? What kind of criteria would we use to define those areas? And how can we name and rename communities according to completely different criteria from the ones that the dominant narrative tells us are important? So that's one thing about language. There's something more, though, and something I think that comes from our spiritual capital. Anna led us in a really interesting conversation, which to me was about symbolic language. You asked us what images, what metaphors, and that opened up a whole new area, which I think aligns with our faith tradition and heritage, which is that when we talk in symbols and we talk in metaphors, we reach a different level of truth. And I think that's really important as well. Which brings me to telling stories, because part of the use of language is the telling of stories. We have a faith tradition that emphasises the use of parables, but I think for me storytelling has always been really, really important as a tool for liberation, a tool for empowerment. If our heritage says there are some people in the world that have stories, but most people are just ordinary and they don't. And you can either have a story because you're a celebrity, or you can have a story because you're notorious. But the vast majority of people in between, we're just particularly people who are of dominant groups. So I think what I took from what you were saying, Al, particularly, but also actually Mohammed, he said we listen to the stories. He set up a food academy because of Stephen's story. Clearly, there was that direct connection. So if we can, and I think this is something that particularly we can offer as faith communities into this agenda, is developing means of telling stories. Personally, I'm passionate about the arts, and I was really interested that it was a passion play that in Hodge Hill became somebody, that the 2 or 3 people who were into drama wanted to do a passion play. So you're telling us another story, putting your own story into it, and transforming the world around you by that kind of storytelling. So, I think that's probably... I was just thinking of the encounter with Jesus and the woman at the well, Samaritan woman. And she goes and she says, "Come and meet the man who told me everything I've ever done." So there was something in the sharing of the story that, to her, changed her life. That's the longest one, so don't judge for 15 minutes by that one. Subversive affinities. I was interested, Chris, at the beginning, talking about, I suppose, hinting that there was a kind of an evolution away from straightforward concepts of partnership. I mean, not that partnerships were ever straightforward, don't get me wrong, but it felt like you were saying, in the current context, we're growing into something more organic, more networky, more unofficial, and that was borne out, I think, in some of the things that we heard. I love the concept of dog walkers and mums at the school gate as kind of unofficial groupings of people or affinities. I think the whole social networking thing that we've touched on also connects with that, because the kinds of affinities you strike up through Twitter or Facebook are not, you're not just mixing with the people that you would normally mix with, perhaps. And the notion that 2 or 3 people with gifts to share can come together and create something or tap into something which is new and different. And so I'm just thinking aloud, really, in terms of some of the power dynamics involved in partnership working that 15 years ago or so, reflecting on whose language is dominant. If a church partners with a local authority, who's got the power? 3 guesses. As faith communities working in partnership with secular agencies, I think it's us. I don't want to talk about us and them, but we have to learn a whole range of language, and not many people return the complement. I think all those paradynamic things are still there, they're still real, but maybe if we're valuing more the ad hoc coalitions, the language of, I've got guerrilla communities came into my mind. I didn't mean G-O-R, I mean G-U-E-R. Sort of communities that are doing stuff which is subversive in small groups. Squatting, it's interesting you use the word squatting, Al, so I'm talking quite a lot about your stuff, but it's maybe because you talked about anarchism that seemed to fit more with it's the kind of subversive ways of being. Chris talked about minimal hierarchies. Mohammed talking about the concept of the Sufra food bank, and the whole notion, I think, of giving food is in itself in many ways subversive. Groupings of people who come together to set up a food bank or to set up a food service or to give food, that's an affinity for a clear purpose. It may well be appropriated by the power structures. We may well be in some ways, but with our eyes wide open, I hope, colluding with certain power structures. But as long as we're aware of that and we hold on to what is it spiritually we're doing, whether it's a Muslim or Christian project or a Muslim or Christian inspired project, we're giving food. We're in a gift economy, not a trade economy. That to me is really important. And the whole notion of food and what it means to human well-being, human identity, those are the considerations I think that we take account of if we're forging subversive affinities to transform society. I've got here a definition of church that I heard from a lesbian feminist theologian in the US, Catholic, about 25 years ago, and it's always stayed with me. Church is an unlikely coalition of justice-seeking friends. An unlikely coalition of justice-seeking friends. There is power in unlikely coalitions. There's challenge in unlikely coalitions. There's unpredictability in unlikely coalitions. And all of those things, for me, are what the subversive affinities of identities that are porous and performative. We get on and we do stuff and we change. And that's really important. Subversive power, every time I look at this I think I've not got much to say, but stuff seems to emerge. Citizens UK, as you probably know, make the distinction between dominant forms of power and relational power. And I think there's plenty in Christian theology and that would make that a thicker concept as well. Al asked the question, where is the power in our neighbourhoods? Similarly, it was a relational power and not dominant power. And I think all these questions about power are really, really important. But the process of hearing into speech felt to me like the process of empowerment. And what it resulted in, it felt like, sometimes, possibly all the time, is it leads to a defiance. You use the word defiance, I love that word. Anger at injustice and defiance. So the empowerment process, if it's about relational power, does that. It names agency where secular power might see victimhood. And it names resilience where it might otherwise be invisible. And I think the authority that faith communities have through, somebody used the phrase, the authority of direct engagement. Was it you, Chris? I can't remember. But I think that's, again, that's really important, that the credibility that faith communities have rests not on whether at the top level they vote for women bishops or not at the right time, but what on the ground is being done day in, day out, week in, week out, to be church. And sometimes I think we don't inhabit the authority and the credibility and influence that that gives us to the extent that we might. And when we form unlikely coalitions, we've just done some joint work with Citizens UK, so it's fresh in my mind. When you're working with other organisations, sometimes you can see your own contribution a lot more clearly than when you're just getting on with stuff on your own. So actually, it's quite powerful that I can write something about food poverty in the Thames Valley based on the experience of the Oxford Diocese, and it's there in, I was going to say black and white, but it's kind of yellow and grey and cream. And that can be used, and it can be fed upwards, and the evidence can speak for itself, and the storytelling, again, can have a different context. I've got the phrase, he speaks with authority and not as the scribes and the Pharisees. I think we have an authority, where we have an authority based on direct experience, we should use it more. How long have I had? Okay. Subversive hope. My colleague was talking about Walter Brueggemann and the prophetic imagination, and I may be misquoting because I wasn't really listening, but I wrote it down because it seemed to echo. It was only 2 days ago. Oh, that sounds like what I'm going to be doing on Wednesday or Tuesday, whatever day it is. Hope comes from knowing that things can be different. The status quo, and that the status quo is not all there is. And I think, again, as faith communities, we have that hope because we have a vision for an alternative society. And when the whole of the power of the media and politics is telling us things can't really be different and there is no alternative and there is no other option, whether it's the austerity agenda or whatever, I think we need to draw on the resources that we have to say, no, things can be different. Al talked about the system versus a different world. And I think one thing that we have to offer through our engagement on the ground is an analysis that gives us a critical edge. So we've talked a lot about food poverty, we've talked a lot about food banks. Our critical edge is about the root causes because we're getting the stories, and because hopefully we can use those stories to drive a bigger analysis. And whilst we're being subversive by giving food, we can also have the analysis around food justice and not food charity, which many of us are working on. That's just one example. But there's loads of ways in which I think hope can be subversive. And finally, the whole concept of faith identities is really interesting. I was interested to hear Mohammed's reflections on kind of the history of the last 14 years from his perspective of Muslim priorities around giving and charity and what kind of initiatives they're supporting. I like the phrase an inside-out church, which somebody came up with before lunch, and of course the urgent slowness as well. How are we being? What kind of faith identity are we embracing? Is it a rigid, stable, we believe this? And that rigid and stable identities, I think, can lead to radical action. And I'm not saying whether that's good or bad, but I think the challenge to us is we've talked a lot about blurriness and blurred categories. And I think if our faith is performative, and we're not just saying, I believe this and therefore I'm going to do that, but I kind of believe this, I'm doing that, and when I've done that, actually this bit feels a bit different now, and I'm not sure I do believe that, and actually how does that fit with what I've been taught? And that's actually what I'm doing over here, is challenging everything I ever thought about God or about my fellow human beings, or whether I'm doing the work of God or just doing what any other human being would do. So I suppose I'm now drawing it into the sort of ecclesiological agenda, I suppose, because we're talking about how faith impacts on politics potentially, but I also want us to hold in mind how our political engagements can, should and ought to impact on our vision of ourselves as people of God, our discipleship, if you like or hate that word. How is that formed and reformed How are we seeking a bigger God through the engagements that we have in our actions on the ground? And I don't think we can know God without taking account of all of the things that we've talked about today and much more. And I think what church as normative institution, in my experience, misses out on is any really good way of making that process happen. Locally, nationally, at every level, it's like you believe this and you do that. End of story. And actually the really exciting bit is how does that rebound and what impact does that have? And until we get that connection, I mean, somebody talks about consumerist concepts of church growth. I don't think any church growth is going to happen. And numerical growth is kind of the least of my worries, although I'm told that if there wasn't numerical growth I wouldn't have a job. Thanks. I'm talking about the growth in depth of what it means to have a faith identity in the context that we're living in. I think that's it. That's my last one. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.